Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, both face-to-face and Zoom. And one thing that I also want to let you all know, if you could tell your colleagues, we are recording this and we'll be posting that to the PI website and to other websites throughout the ISU website. I believe it'll be on Marcom. It'll be on our new COVID-19 website. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, or if you had colleagues who wanted to attend, but they can't, please pass that information along. So that should be posted up in just a couple of days. For those of you who are in the audience with us today, of course, please exercise your best efforts to social distance as appropriate. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to excuse yourself. That's no problem. You can participate via Zoom or look at the video recording at a later date. So that being said, my name is Karen Appleby. I am the co-coordinator of the Program for Instructional Effectiveness, along with my colleague, Margaret Johnson, here at ISU. In light of our recent changes in instruction, we wanted to provide faculty with as much information and support as possible to make the transition from face-to-face to a distance learning platform or an online platform as smooth as possible. So today I have a couple of guests that I'd like to introduce. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Kidder. Lisa is joining us via distance. Lisa, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Lisa's the Senior Instructional Technologist for the ITRC here on campus, and she's been involved with online education for over 20 years, having taught across multiple platforms of both K-12, higher education settings. Her dissertation is focused on teaching effectively in a learning management system, and Lisa and all of the other ITRC instructors are here to answer any technology-specific questions that you have about this transition. I'm also excited to introduce our workshop facilitator this afternoon, Dr. Alex Bollinger. Alex is a faculty member in the Department of Marketing and Management. Alex has successfully transitioned 2 large online discussion-based graduate classes from a face-to-face format to a synchronous online format. He currently teaches such a course to 47 graduate students in various locations, so that's a lot of students. And while his transition to this format was certainly different than what we're experiencing right now, Alex is going to share lots of his tips and tricks to facilitate classroom discussion, group work, and to continue a sense of community in our classes as we move forward to these different formats. So I'd also like to remind everyone of the tip sheet that the ITRC sent out last week. That was in all of our campus communication. This tip sheet provides lots of different pieces of information, links, resources for faculty who are moving to an online or distance format. It's entitled Teaching Effectively During Times of Disruption. So also please remember that, as always, the ITRC remains open and available. I know lots of you have been to the ITRC already today, so they will be open to help us through this entire transition. So now I'd like to bring Alex to the stage. Thank you, Alex.
All right, well, thank you everyone here in person and everyone online, both here at ISU and kind of throughout the continent. This is a great opportunity, even as it's a kind of a moment of difficulty that we're all experiencing. So I want to thank you for your attendance, and I want to tell you a little bit about kind of what the idea behind this is, and then sort of give you a sense for the agenda of some of the things that I'd like to cover. And then what I'll do is I'll step back after having been through a few of these things and give some time for discussion and questions. And we can field questions from those of you here in person in the room, as well as people who are attending online. So let's go ahead and start. So to give you kind of a sense for the goals for today's session. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you my story. And it's a specific class for a specific time. And so the situation for you might be slightly different. You're teaching perhaps a different topic, or you might have a different sort of population of students. And so you can kind of customize that as you see fit. But really the emphasis for me is on what's possible. So to give you kind of a broader sense of what I did, the kinds of things that you can do in an online synchronous sort of environment, and a few of the considerations that I learned. My process has been a lot of trial and a whole lot more error. So I want to share some of those potholes before you step in, some of the things that I have over time. I also want to reiterate what Karen said about the Instructional Technology Resource Center here at ISU. They are an amazing resource, and they were incredibly instrumental for me in helping me to get online, especially early on when I had no experience and was actually quite skeptical about the possibility of taking a very interactive behavioral class like negotiation skills and trying to transfer that to an online setting. So I'm grateful that Lisa is here and can field some of those technical questions. What I want to mention right at the outset is I'm sure I just scratched the surface in terms of some of the tools that are available and the possibilities. And so she can fill in on some of those things as well. What I will be focusing on particularly are two of the tools that I use for my classes: Zoom, which is a web conferencing software, as well as Moodle, which is a course management, online management thing that we use here at ISU. So for those of you who are attending who are not here at Idaho State University, you may use a different web conferencing tool at your university, for example. And so again, the idea is to give you kind of a broader sense of what's possible, even if you need to sort of translate that to your particular tool. And we'll talk then a bit and some opportunities for discussion and questions. So the agenda for today, I want to very quickly define what online synchronous is and how it differs from other types of online, give you a quick sense of the advantages and disadvantages, tell you a bit about my story, how I went from having something that was completely face-to-face and putting it online, describe some other possibilities as well as considerations for as you think about putting your class online, and particularly if you have a really short amount of time, where do you kind of triage? If you've got just a week or two to get your class online, what are some of the things to consider? Okay, so as a starting point, there are different types of online classes, and two of the sort of broad groupings would be online asynchronous and online synchronous. And what that refers to is whether you meet at a set time on, say, a weekly basis. So with online asynchronous, a lot of online classes, especially early on, focused on online asynchronous. And in fact, I think a lot of students, when you say online, they just sort of immediately assume that it's going to be asynchronous. What that means, for example, is it could look like self-guided modules or discussion boards, or you could post videos, for example, lecture notes. The idea is that students have the opportunity to work through kind of at their pace. You don't necessarily meet at a set time on a weekly basis. Whereas with online synchronous, you still meet at a particular time, a particular date. With my classes, it's, for example, on Thursday nights from 6 to 8:45 p.m., right? And so all students are expected to be there on time to stay through the full amount of time as though they were in a regular class. And the mechanism that we use is web conferencing software, so something like Zoom, right? And then we also use some of the features that Zoom enables, so things like chat and breakout rooms and different ways of interacting. But again, the idea is that we're all together virtually, right? They have to be there at a set time on set days, but it can be anywhere that they've got access to a good internet connection. So it could be the beach for all we know, right? As long as they've got access to a good connection. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both asynchronous and synchronous. Certainly with asynchronous, the biggest advantage is it maximizes the flexibility for students. But one of the big disadvantages is that it tends to be less engaging, and it requires a lot of students. It requires that students be pretty disciplined and often kind of self-starters. And so sometimes, depending on your population, students can struggle with asynchronous. The flip side with online synchronous, and probably the biggest advantage that led me to finally say, okay, I feel at least somewhat comfortable with taking a class like negotiation and trying it in this format, is that it's more engaging. It gives you opportunities to have interaction that you wouldn't be able to have, for example, if you didn't have that kind of, electronically mediated interaction at a particular time. It's also nice because it gives regular touch points. So rather than sort of providing things and then not kind of having these regular reminders for students, I use my online synchronous class sessions each week to provide regular reminders. So at the end, I'll summarize and I'll say, okay, we've gone through this material today. For next week, here are your assignments, and sort of lay them out and give them opportunities to ask me clarifying questions and things like that. I'll also talk about the communication that I do in between, it's pretty much impossible to over-communicate in an online class, is what I've discovered. And so I'll send, at least on a weekly basis, I'll send emails out to students, usually at the beginning of a week, just as a reminder that, hey, this is what's coming up for this week's class, a reminder of deadlines coming up, and some other miscellaneous things that we include. The disadvantages, of course, for an online synchronous is there is a little bit less flexibility. Students need to be meeting at a particular time on particular dates in order to make that work. And I think then maybe the biggest, and one of the reasons that we're here as far as disadvantages, is that it can be a little bit technically daunting, especially the first time through. And so that's what we're hoping to kind of help you with a little bit today and give you some scaffolding as you think about moving things to an online synchronous environment. So let me break into my story here a bit. So 5 years ago, I was asked to take an online or a face-to-face negotiations class, which was from the Masters of Business Administration or MBA graduate course curriculum, and to not only teach it one section face-to-face, but then have an additional section that was taught online synchronously.
Excuse
me. So initially I was really skeptical because my negotiation class, it's very much dependent on that personal interaction. I have students get together, they do role plays. And so one student might, for example, be the hiring manager of a company, taking on that role, and they're given a whole set of role instructions about kind of their preferences if they're in that role. And then they're paired with someone who is a prospective new recruit. And so they each read their role materials, and then I send them off to a breakout room, and they've got 30 minutes to negotiate. And there are, let's say, 8 issues that they've got to come to agreement on. They come back, we post their results on the board, and then we say, oh, this is interesting. Let's compare and see what happened here. And then, you know, what are some of the insights that you got from it, and get some of their reflections and use that as a way to sort of pivot into the discussion. And it's been very effective as a method, because rather than just sort of talking theoretically about how negotiation should happen, they have an opportunity to try it out, in some cases fail, right? Or at least it may not go quite the way that they thought. And then that gives them a real opportunity. First off, it gets their attention. But then second off, it's, oh yeah, I see this. So now they have a shared set of experiences that we can leverage as we launch into the concepts and the discussion. So the question was, is there any way to do that in an online environment that doesn't sort of gut that entire approach, that entire model? And so that was really the challenge. That was the difficulty that was involved. This whole idea, it's based on, just to kind of give you a little bit of some theoretical backing on it, the experiential learning cycle from Kolb's work. And the idea is, and several of you I'm sure are familiar with this already, but sort of the underlying idea of this is that you provide concrete experiences, like for example in negotiation, where students have the opportunity to sort of see what works, what doesn't, and then reflect on that. And we use that reflection then as an opportunity to step back and say, okay, what does the literature say about this? What is theoretical best practice? What are some of the reasons in which you might be experiencing that? And then from there, it gives them opportunities to experiment. So the next week, when they do their next negotiation, they can try a slightly different tactic or a different approach. And so it's a really kind of an elegant way of jumping into and recreating the kinds of things that they'll see when they get out into industry. Maybe a different way of thinking of it would be they get a chance to do it, and then they ask themselves what just happened, right? And then they can say, okay, so this happened, but what are the implications? So what for me? And then, so now what do I do differently? And the cycle repeats. And ideally, that's going to happen on a week-to-week basis, and they're going to get just a little bit better week by week. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to recreate in an online environment. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. So in my class, for example, one step would be they start with the one-on-one negotiation, but instead of having physical breakout rooms, I send them to virtual breakout rooms using the functionality of Zoom. So quite literally, let's say that I've got a class of 47 students like I have this semester. What I'll do is I will match them up beforehand, and I will pair them up in breakout rooms, and they're given an invitation, but they're matched up with the person that they're assigned to. So one person will have the role of the hiring manager, one the role of the new recruit, the prospective employee, and they've each had a chance to read their role materials beforehand. So what that requires of me is I need to email before class the role materials to the hiring managers and the role materials to the people who are playing the new recruits. Then they're sent an invitation and they go to their breakout rooms, and when they're in their breakout rooms, they can just hear each other. So there are just two people in any given breakout room. And they're given the 30 minutes, and then at the end of their 30 minutes, they're sent a notification, they're sent back to the main room, and we do the same things that we would do in the in-person class. So we compare the results. I have an Excel spreadsheet where I type things up, compare their results, and we use that to talk about a concept. So one of the concepts we talk about is a BATNA, right? Your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This idea of, do you know if you were in this negotiation, and let's say this just doesn't work out, you and the hiring manager just can't come to an agreement, what's the next best thing you could go to? What's your next alternative, right? And we use that, and we might talk about it in that class and then talk about it in the subsequent class and several class periods to sort of reiterate that point. And then ultimately sort of have opportunities for reflection, whether it be a reflection paper or a pre-negotiation strategy plan. So I might ask them the next time before they negotiate to write down, okay, what do you think would be your best alternative if this doesn't work out in this particular situation? So again, kind of the idea is, how do we take and maintain fidelity to something that we're already doing in person, right? But try to translate it to an online environment. So I want to give you just kind of a sense of some of my rules of engagement, if you will, from my teaching philosophy. And then I want to sort of step back more broadly and talk a little bit more broadly about some of the considerations that I think about as I'm putting stuff in an online synchronous format. So first, these are things that apply whether you're face-to-face or online, but I think they're particularly relevant as you're thinking about moving to an online setting. So the first is trying to avoid within-class stagnation. And this is really easy, especially if a student is at home, right? They don't have sort of that social presence. I mean, at least when they're face-to-face, we can tell if they're a little bit, right? If they're completely sitting in the corner and watching Thursday night football or something like that, right? So there is that element. And so one of the things that's really important with online classes in particular, online synchronous, is to provide these opportunities to do a lot of different things where it moves them around. So we'll transition from lecture, for example, to group discussion. One of my favorite tactics is think, pair, share, where I'll build up breakout rooms, and I'll send them to the breakout room for 3 minutes. And they've got 3 minutes to discuss sort of a question of the day, and then they'll come back to the main room. But again, the idea is it sort of breaks down those barriers, and it's particularly intimidating. I mean, it's one thing to speak in front of a class of your peers when you can see everyone. That is intimidating enough. But in an online setting, online synchronous, when it's a web conference, you may be with 46 other people and you haven't seen their face, right? So it really is kind of an unknown. And so ironically, in some cases, I've found that students can actually be more inhibited in terms of contributing in an online environment, especially early in the semester. And so that's one, you can think of different ways of sort of breaking down those kinds of barriers. Another thing to consider is to appeal to different learning styles. Sometimes with online classes, it's really easy to focus a lot on, say, visual learning, because that's kind of the most accessible in that format. And so I think a lot about, how do you appeal to application? How do you find ways to apply this? And so the role plays that we do, for example, and the breakout rooms that we use are ways of building that in. And then, again, something that applies, whether it's face-to-face or online, how do you make each of the concepts as real as possible? So how do you make the clear connection between, what is a BATNA and why does it matter that you know what your BATNA is the next time that you negotiate for salary or the next time that you're negotiating for a new house or something like that? All right, so I want to start with a few, just sort of some broader considerations and give you just a sense for some of the things that are possible within Zoom that I've used in my classes, just so that you kind of have a sense as you're, especially if you're in a situation where you're kind of tackling this for the first time very quickly, right? It's one thing to understand the technical side and you'll sort of scaffold into that. But the other piece is just sort of knowing what you can do, what's available to you. So I want to share a few of the ideas, some things that I've added, and I want to make the point that I didn't use all of these right away. So you don't necessarily have to use all of these resources. But depending on your particular topic and your particular population of students, some of these may be more or less helpful to you, so you can pick and choose a bit. One of the things that Zoom provides is chat. So there's a chat box, and you can chat with everyone in the class. Students can send out a chat to anyone in the class, sort of everyone at once, or they can send it out to individuals. One of the ways I've used this, for example, is before class starts, kind of those 5 to 10 minutes of dead time before you really launch into it. I might put in the chat kind of a question of the day, sort of, hi everyone. As we get going today, be thinking about this question. And so they can kind of use it as a way, kind of an anticipatory set that kind of gets them going a little bit and prepares them. It's also helpful because if you start on the dead run and ask them a question, a lot of times you'll get dead silence, right? You sort of need to give them time to process. And particularly if your connection has any lag to it at all, it can feel like forever between when you ask the question and when people, for example, in Zoom, raise their hand, and they can actually virtually raise their hand and you can call on them. But there could be a significant 20-second, 30-second lag sometimes. And so if you give them a little bit of time to prepare, that can be helpful. Other things you can do, other kinds of discussion questions. So you can have those posted. I've used this or an online synchronous format not only for a negotiation class, but also for a class on relational leadership. This is the first semester that I've done that. So I'm very much in practice with putting a face-to-face class online. This happened just earlier this year. And so this would be an example of a discussion question from my relational leadership class that again sort of gets things rolling, and you can have this posted. You can share your screen, and so what I might do is I might start my PowerPoint, for example, with a discussion question. You can also annotate in real time. So there are different ways of doing it. One way is you can just be working on PowerPoint as you go, or you can annotate in Zoom. So for example, they've actually got a way that you can add a text box, or you can do different things like that. If you want to draw a little arrow, sort of as close as you can get to a whiteboard or a chalkboard without actually being able to use that. So those are opportunities as well. And again, they can see your screen as you share it. You can ask a poll question. Zoom in particular has an opportunity for poll questions. And so you could start off, get a sense, it's helpful for them, but it's also helpful for you. How many of you have negotiated with someone in the last 30 days? If no one says that they have, then okay, this is good. I'm going to have to start from ground zero, right? Let's take a step back. Whereas if 80, 90% of them have negotiated, you know that you're going to be able to tap into a lot of their experiences. And so you can kind of lead a little bit differently in that way. So it gives you a sense for kind of the population that you're dealing with. Other things that I've done, and this is especially relevant when you have a whole semester to prepare, but you could even do it in sort of a shorter amount of time. I actually assign student groups to lead the discussions, much as you would in a graduate seminar, in a face-to-face format. So we have cases pretty much each week, many of them from Harvard Business School. And we'll take those cases and I'll actually assign them to lead the case. And we've gotten to the point where students themselves will actually share their own screen. And so they'll actually run the PowerPoint off of their screen. They'll take turns presenting as though they were in class. And there have been some really interesting presentations. I've gotten some really interesting ideas. I think in some cases, the online format and the fact that students aren't able to meet face-to-face and so have to meet not just in the class itself, but also to discuss and put together their presentation, whether it's Google Hangouts or a Zoom session that I set up or something else. It kind of facilitates a creativity that's very different in some ways from what I see in the face-to-face classes. You can show multimedia clips, and there's a way to share your computer sound. So if you're sharing your screen, it can actually share the sound. And so you can just show, for example, a TED Talk just right on your computer. And that works really well, you know, if you've got a sufficient connection. Connection here at ISU in my office is where I run it from, and it's been bug-free for many, many semesters. So it's worked out well for me. And then I also just wanted to show, I've mentioned this several times, but you can use breakout groups. And for the kinds of classes that I teach, this is pretty much non-negotiable. This is probably the single most important functional piece, because what this allows you to do is it allows you to have small group discussions and breakout negotiations without total chaos, without everyone having to be in the same room. So it works pretty well. I've redacted student names, but this is a screenshot from a couple of classes ago. And so you can see that I've got different breakout rooms. With a class of 47, we've got a bunch of breakout rooms. And it will show you not just the numbers in each breakout room, but also the names of each of the students. And if, for example, a student fails to go from the main room into the breakout room, that's a sign for me to follow up, to get on Zoom and say, hey, are you there? They may not be there, or they may have stepped away or something like that, or, you know, they might be having technical difficulties as well. And so it's a way to kind of be proactive and get a sense for who's with you, and if they're not, why not? All right. Yes, question here. Yeah, please.
I noticed it said automatically. So if you wanted to make up, so you had about groups of say 3, would it randomly assign them?
Yes, so
in the groups?
Right. So let me just repeat your question for the people on Zoom.
Great. Yeah.
So the question is, seeing this as sort of, as you're assigning, it can be either automatically or manually. Yes, so you're right. If you were to keep the automatic on, then what it would do is you'd tell the number of rooms that you wanted to create, and then it would just sort of throw people into those rooms. So let's say there are 47 people in a class, and you've got 15 rooms. So it would be roughly 3 to 4 in any given room, and they would just randomly assign people. You can also manually assign people. So for the negotiation, that's what I would do. Yeah, great question. And I want to reserve some time as well for questions from those of you on Zoom as well. So we'll definitely set aside some time for that. Just a couple of additional considerations that I want to kind of give you, and this is sort of the world according to my experience. So you know, you take it with a grain of salt. But these are some of the things that I've come across, and just some ideas that I'd like to share with you. I mentioned this already. My experience has been that it's really difficult to over-communicate in online, and it's really easy to under-communicate. It seems like you're sending out emails a lot, but the way that someone has explained it to me, the metaphor they've used, and I think it's appropriate for these times, is that especially for students who are in an online synchronous environment or any online class, a lot of times they feel like they're in an airplane that has not been cleared to land. And so they're circling and they're circling, right? And they're waiting for some reassurance. And the longer they don't get that reassurance, the more frantic they get, and the worse and worse things get. Even if there's no imminent danger per se, right? They start to panic, they start to think, what did I miss? That kind of thing. So what I would recommend is, for example, in my class, every week I send out an email early in the week, Monday, for a Thursday class. Kind of give them a sense for what's coming up, who's presenting that week. I give them a sense of deadlines, and I talk about not just that week, but I also look 3 or 4 weeks down the road. So, you know, this is what we're doing this week, but we've got our next paper is due in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So again, it's kind of this sense of just to try to communicate as much as possible. The other piece of that, and this is something that I encourage for all faculty who are using this method, is that if you can reach out to students, or if you can make yourself available to students, that they can reach out to you at any point, that's incredibly helpful. I would say that I probably have phone calls with students in my online class, probably 3 or 4 phone calls a week, in addition to answering a lot of email. That's really important to me, and what I've discovered is people really appreciate that. And I think, again, that sort of that airplane metaphor, circling in the air, right? The more certainty they can have, the better off it is. And so I try to remember that even when it's the 25th email of the week and I'm feeling like, oh boy, I think I said this already, right? So the more you can communicate and just sort of accept that there's some redundancy, I think students really tend to appreciate that. Another thing too, and this is kind of an unexpected benefit of online classes, particularly online synchronous, is that the personal touch matters a lot to students. And it's related to this idea that they can feel disconnected when they don't have sort of that in-person experience. So one of the things that I do, for example, I had an assignment in my relational leadership class where they were asked to get feedback on their strengths and weaknesses from 3 or 4 different people in their life. And then rather than writing a paper, I asked them to make a short video of themselves and basically talking about their strengths and weaknesses, what resonated with their experience, what they learned from their experience, that kind of thing, and to share that with me. And then what I did is I went back in and I gave feedback on all 47 of them, which did take a long time. But the feedback that I received from them was remarkable. And what it showed to me is that they appreciate, I think, even more than, even if we're doing the same kinds of things that we would do in a face-to-face class, I think the fact that they're online, a lot of times they appreciate it more. And the fact that you're willing to reach out and to give sort of that personal touch is really meaningful oftentimes. So there are advantages to this kind of a format. And I think particularly in a time like this, where anything you can do to kind of reassure students is a positive as well. A couple of other considerations. Holding students accountable is really important. I take attendance in my classes the same as I would for an in-person experience. And I'm looking from the very beginning of class to the very end of class. So if people have to leave early, for example. Also participation. So I take regular participation grades. What I do is I record my class sessions for their benefit, but it's also, it turns out, for my benefit, because I can go back in, I can look at who participated and who did not, and then, sort of build participation grades around that. So it actually triangulates the information that I'm sort of capturing in real time as well. Other things to consider, if you can accommodate different learning styles, personalities. One of the things I've discovered, I mentioned this earlier, some students are really intimidated in an online synchronous kind of setting. And so one of the things I put in my syllabus is that I expect everyone to contribute in class at some point throughout the semester. But I realize there may not be enough airtime for everyone, every class. And so, for example, if they had a great point and the moment passed, they just didn't have a chance to get it in, I encourage them to send an email after the fact to just sort of tell me about it. If they've got resources that are relevant to our class, they can send them to me. Sometimes I'll post them on Moodle as well to share them with the rest of the class with their permission. So there are ways that they can sort of back into interaction, and I think that that's helpful as well, particularly if they're a little bit less outgoing or a little bit more intimidated by the format, especially initially. This is a consideration for you as an instructor, and I think this is particularly true if you don't have experience with this before. 5 years ago, when I started doing online synchronous, I was amazed by the information overload because I got on, I had chat boxes that were going and people were having conversations in the chat, and I had to keep track of attendance, and I was trying to get the class started, and I was trying to listen to what people were saying in response to my questions, and I thought my brain was going to explode. So it's good to know that going in, right? And you can manage that actively. So for example, in Zoom, it gives you ways of actually turning off the chat. So if you especially early on, if you just feel like it's too much, you can sort of manage that. Having the breakout rooms is also really helpful because it gives students the opportunity to sort of discuss among themselves. And so it allows them to talk about some of the things that otherwise they would have to reserve for the main group discussion. So there are benefits to that as well. But be mindful of that. Don't beat yourself up. Don't be too hard on yourself if the first couple of times seem a little bit overwhelming to you in addition to the students. It's not an unusual experience. One other consideration that I want to mention, and this was something that several people that I've talked to recently have sort of wondered about as we move to this online very quickly. What are the options for exams? And so Lisa will also be able to speak to this, and so I want to not get too much into detail on it for the moment, but what I do want to tell you is that I've tried a couple of different options. Given that I do classes over the course of a full semester and have had the opportunity to prepare, in my negotiation class, I have one exam and I require that it be proctored. And so for students who are in town here at ISU in Pocatello, or at one of the ISU campuses around the state, Meridian, Twin Falls, Idaho Falls, they can just use the ISU proctoring service and it works great. ISU Testing Center. If they're in Northern Idaho, for example, they can use a community college. North Idaho College is one that we use often. Or students who are down in Salt Lake City will use Salt Lake Community College's testing center. Occasionally, I will have students who are not close to that kind of a facility. For example, I had a student who took an exam one time on a hunting trip up by Salmon. So he actually made arrangements with the librarian at the Salmon Public Library to have the exam proctored. I sent it to her, she proctored it, sent it back to me. So it worked out really well. So there are lots of creative ways you can do it. I've even had a student who's tuned in from a naval carrier, like a seagoing naval carrier out in the ocean. So we had to make some really creative arrangements for that, but it's possible. It provides a lot of locational flexibility. If that's not an option in this particular case, there are some other things as well. There is Examity, for example, which is an online proctoring service that I've not used personally, but that's an option for those of you here at ISU. Also, you can put exams on Moodle using the quiz function. You pretty much, as far as I can tell, would need to sort of just make the assumption that it would be an open book quiz at that point, and you could set specific time limits. You also want to be careful about revealing answers after the fact to make sure that each student is sort of on a level playing ground. And there are some different options that you can use to make sure that that works. The other thing too, and this may be particularly relevant on short notice, is it might make sense to replace an exam with a paper or project. In my relational leadership class, for example, rather than a final exam, we have a final project, a final paper, and it's sort of built out a little bit further rather than sort of in lieu of having an exam. So there are different options that you can use, and I'm sure others of you who are tuning in today have probably considered other things as well. So there might be other options for how to make that work. Okay, so just a couple of other quick thoughts before stepping back for a little bit of discussion and questions. If you've got just 1 week to get online, which is the situation facing a lot of us, right, or a lot of you, the first thing to do is to identify the elements of your class that readily translate from face-to-face to online, and that may require thinking creatively about adapting. For example, if let's say that you are leading a jazz band or a musical ensemble, that's pretty tough to get that online, right? But there may be ways around. You may not be able to replicate the in-person experience of playing in a jazz band, but for example, I've known instructors who will they'll take a piece that the group was playing and they'll ask students to download the recording and then to play along their part, play along with the recording, and then turn that into the instructor. So you could still actually sort of grade their progress and hold them accountable for their part, even if in this turn of events they don't necessarily get to perform. So I think what has been eye-opening to me about this experience is how many creative ways there are to utilize online synchronous, but sometimes it takes a lot of thought and sort of reshaping your paradigm a little bit about kind of what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? What do I want students to get out of this? Also, adaptations we talked about for exams, quizzes, deliverables. One thing that's really important, again, going back to that airplane metaphor, you want to contact students. If you haven't done so already, do so as soon as you can. Let them know what the plan is. Reduce the uncertainty as soon as you can. And just recognize that you can only do your best, especially under these circumstances. Do the best that you can. Try to maintain as much fidelity to the original experience, and then there may be some things that have to be let go because of the circumstances. The flip side is that there are bright sides, right? And I think one of the biggest things, as I mentioned to you before, is that you can positively violate students' expectations. I think a lot of students have really negative expectations of online classes, and I've been amazed because I teach a face-to-face class followed by an online synchronous class in a semester. I'm able to do a comparison because it's the exact same material. And it's just me one night, one day and then the next. And what's remarkable, I mean, certainly the online experience, students, my experience has been that they haven't enjoyed it as much as the face-to-face. You just can't completely substitute for a face-to-face experience. But actually, the reviews have been remarkably good for the online synchronous. And I think part of that is that students really appreciate if faculty are willing to step out and do what they can to make the experience as engaging as possible. And they'll be willing to accept some of the limitations of the medium because you have a lot of opportunities to show them that you care. And I think that's something that students really care about. Also, keep in mind that some students will thrive in this format in ways that they don't in person. And this may be sort of a natural experiment. You may actually see this. I've seen this in my negotiation classes. Some students, especially those who are a little bit less outspoken, tend to really have a rough time with face-to-face negotiations. Whereas in an online environment where they have a little bit more time to step back and think, where they're not sort of right face-to-face with the other person, they actually perform better. So some students will actually do better in an online environment. And I think that that's nice to recognize and figure out ways that you can sort of leverage the experience for them. It's also a great opportunity for perspective taking for faculty like me, because what it forces me to do is it forces me to examine my assumptions and say, okay, this is the way I've always done things in a face-to-face class, but how does this play with students? How are they interpreting it? And as I've had to move things into an online format, I've realized that there are a lot of things, I was making a lot of assumptions that I was saved by the fact that we were just sort of face-to-face and they could ask me the questions right there. When you're in an online environment, you have to be much more proactive about anticipating what some of the students' questions can be. So there are advantages, there are benefits to it, even as it is a potential difficulty as well. So I want to take a moment now. I've had a chance to talk quite a bit, so I want to pause for discussions and questions from people here in person as well as online. Yes? Oh.
I would just ask everybody in the room has questions. If you just go to the front and use the microphone, without nobody wants to hear it. So, thank you.
So just, that's great. So just repeating what Karen said. Yeah, so right, that makes sense. Oh.
Okay. Oh, there it is. I couldn't see that. So two questions, actually. You mentioned recording, and will Zoom record breakout rooms so that you can go back and see what went on?
So that's a great question, and Lisa will be able to answer it 100%. Before I go on the record and giving you the wrong information, my guess is no for the breakout rooms.
Second question then is actually my biggest concern. There could be 1,000 to 2,000 people at ISU alone on Zoom at one given time. Multiply that by 1,000 universities across the country. Number one, do we have the infrastructure for that? And number two, does Zoom have the infrastructure for that kind of demand?
I'll jump in here, Alex.
Okay, there she is.
So in terms of Zoom, the company has made Zoom free for all of the K-12 students that are going online. So at this point in time, yes, there are concerns. So we are recommending that if there's anything that you can do asynchronously, that you do that. But to use your synchronous time productively and really make sure that you follow some of the recommendations that Alex has given there. If you're just going to lecture, we recommend you just record that to help with that bandwidth to be a good global citizen in this context. And then to also have a backup such as Google Meet.
Lisa, could you repeat that real quick? Google what?
Google Meet.
Google Meet, okay.
Right. We have access to the Google tools, so Google Meet, Google Hangouts, all of those are good backups.
And then I just wanted to add to the breakout rooms and recording. This is Lance Rowe from the ITRC. So what happens with that, so if in this example, if Alex was teaching a class using breakout rooms and he was recording, it would follow him. So if he was jumping from room to room, that would be part of the recording, but it's not going to record each individual's room. In a case like that, as the host, you can allow participants to record one by one. So you might think about having a group lead for their breakout room and allowing them to record their breakout session if you wanted to capture all of that. There's a lot of wheels turning and a lot of things that have to happen, but there is a lot of legwork that has to happen if you want to record during breakout rooms.
Oh, that's great. I learned something. It's never been an issue for me, but it sounds like that opportunity is there if that's kind of a primary concern. Yeah. Thanks, Lisa and Lance. Yeah. So other questions? Yes, please.
Teaching and engineering, many of our classes are problem solving. And so we'd like to be able to solve a problem while the students are watching us or meeting with us in Google Meet or Zoom or something like that. Is there a way to have the students be asking questions and immediately modify the solution that you may be talking about?
So in Zoom, you have the option to use a whiteboard. One of the nice things about it that I was playing more with this last week is that it kind of auto-corrects some of your zigzaggies. So yes, you would just share your whiteboard and you have a pencil tool, you have an eraser tool, you do different shapes and sizes and colors. You will want to practice or look at using some sort of stylus input. Call us, we can help you with practicing with some of that.
Can I make a comment about Mary's question? This is Tracy.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I teach math, which is similar to engineering, that we typically give lectures on blackboards. We don't use PowerPoint. So what I would recommend doing if you have an iPad, what I would do is, like this is dependent on having an iPad, but make a handout with gaps as a PDF, and then you can plug your iPad into your computer so that when you share the screen, you can write on your iPad, you know, the iPad is shared. And then the students can see you write on that handout with gaps in an app like Notability or OneNote. So you can simulate a Blackboard lecture. And then another comment is something I've used is the Google Jamboard is a shared whiteboard, and we have access to that through our G Suite tools. So, you know, you can write on the Jamboard and the student can write on it simultaneously.
There's sort of nervous laughter in here. That's great. Thank you. That's
Can I add one more
really helpful. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
PowerPoint also, you're able to draw on PowerPoint, which if you have, again, an iPad or a touchscreen tablet, you can do some things that way in addition if it's a more structured example that you're working through as opposed to something that's more amenable to like a whiteboard.
All right, thank you.
Hi, this is Chris Jackson with the College of Pharmacy. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Chris.
We'll be using breakout rooms for some of our courses, and the question came up recently. we're looking to do breakout rooms for about a room of 90 students, and with the automatic function, my understanding from your presentation is that they'll just randomly assign them to breakout rooms. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So if the students were then to go back to the main room to continue a portion of lecture, and then we send them back into breakout rooms to continue discussion, will they go into the same breakout rooms, or will they then be randomized again?
Right. Now, that's a great question. So what my experience has been is that if I create breakout rooms, even if it's automatically created, those breakout rooms stay available even if everyone comes back to the main room, so that if then I send them back, they can go back to the same rooms. However, you also have an option, you can recreate the rooms. So if I didn't like those rooms the first time, I could just go in, recreate them, and then you would start over and it would be a whole different randomized set.
So do they move themselves, or does it move them?
Yeah, so the way that it's worked, at least in my class, and Lisa and Lance might be able to weigh in with some other options as well, but what will happen is I will open the rooms, and at that point it automatically sends them a notification that you are assigned to breakout room 12 or 13, whatever it would be, right? And so then they click on something and it sends them right there. And then they get notification, and they typically move themselves back, but I can also close out all rooms and just sort of kicks them back to the main room.
Okay.
That is correct behavior. Something else that Zoom can allow, again, this is something that requires a little bit of legwork on your end as the instructor, but you can do preset breakout rooms. It means that the students have to sign in with an account, whereas before, students can just log in and not do that. So it takes some planning in place, but there is a way that you can manually get the breakout room or get the groups that you want preset, and then have it ready for your Zoom meeting later on. And of course, if you have more questions about that, you can come to the ITRC and we can talk about strategies for accomplishing that task.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Other questions?
I have another question.
Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
It's on a related note to breakout rooms. I'm trying to figure out a way. I do a lot of the administration for the computer science department, and we'd like to make it a way so that our entire department of students can get tutoring help from tutors. And I tried to picture how to use Zoom to do this, in particular with breakout rooms, maybe either a breakout room per class or a breakout room per tutor, so that students can all go to kind of a certain lobby and then get individual help. I don't see there's any way that students can join a breakout room. They have to be assigned. Is that correct, first of all?
Correct.
Is there a better way to do something like that?
A better strategy for that. So what you can do is Zoom does have something called the waiting room feature. So your tutors, given a basic or a licensed account, they just need a Zoom account. They would then be able to create their own meetings and enable this waiting room feature. So that way this link is just a regular Zoom meeting. When the student clicks on it, they're put into a virtual waiting room, and then the tutor can bring them into the room when they're ready to work with them, and then have that student leave and bring in the next student and rotate through. It's also perfect for office hours, so that way you're not creating several meetings per student. You just create one meeting and allow all users to use that link to join.
So could you have multiple tutors that have the same waiting room then?
It would be one meeting per tutor.
Okay.
I mean, when you start getting breakout rooms involved, because we were looking at this for a support option, but what ends up happening is when you try to put multiple people to manage these rooms, you've got too many co-hosts going on, and they don't have the same privileges. So you'd be better off having each tutor with their own designated Zoom meeting list.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
All right, great. Other questions? So I've got a couple of other slides that if it's all right, I'll go ahead and show those. And then what we can do is we can kind of step back and go from there. And if you've got other questions that come up, we can address those and sort of see how things play out from there. So let me just give you a couple of thoughts. So I just want to kind of show you the interface, how it would look. And again, this is from the perspective of someone 5 years ago who had never considered this before. And we were using a tool different from Zoom at the time. But if you are at ISU and you have a Zoom account that's already in Moodle, then what you'll do is you'll go to add an activity or resource, just like you would do, for example, for a submission link for an assignment or things like that. And you'll have multiple options. And if you have an account, then what will show up is the option to create a Zoom meeting. And there's also a place to request an account if you don't already have that account. So anyway, you can do it through Moodle. And so the way that I usually treat it is I will create the meeting for Moodle in advance. A lot of times I'll just sort of create all the meetings for the semester beforehand. So everything's ready to go in Moodle at the beginning of the semester. And there are different approaches to this. What I prefer to do is to have a separate meeting for each week, just so I can record each of the meetings. It's a little bit cleaner for students. It helps them to kind of keep track of things. So I will have that set up, and then also any resources. So if we're going to talk about a particular assignment that week, I'll have the assignment sheet posted on Moodle, so they're ready to go. Then when the session itself is ready to go, it will be set up. I try to set it up for more time in duration than the actual meeting time that we specify. So if we're going to be in class for 3 hours, I like to have a little bit of time on each side, for example, to do office hours. And then also, one of the things I've discovered with my class is a lot of times students in my class like to get together after class and just sort of meet in a breakout room to get ready for the next week, especially if they're going to be presenting. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just sort of keep the meeting open, and I'll work on other stuff and allow them to work in the breakout room for as long as they need. So it's helpful to kind of have that as an option. There's also a join link, which is available, for example, if you want to invite someone from outside the class. There are times where I will bring in guest speakers, for example, and so I can just send the link to them and they can join. In fact, I've had guest speakers who have just joined by their smartphone, which is amazing. And I'm really impressed by the functionality of Zoom. And actually, that's about the end for my slides. So let me do this. The one other thing I just wanted to point out is afterwards, when I record a session, I then post that recording in the same week after the fact. So if students want to come back, and that's actually turned out to be one of the more popular features of these online synchronous classes. I've actually had some students who've opted to take the online class versus, say, driving down to Pocatello in person, partly because it gives them the opportunity as they're preparing for an exam where they can go back and review material in class with the recording. So I make sure to make that available to them as well. All right. And I think these are just other details that we'll have posted as well if you want to, for example, use the quiz feature to create an exam in Moodle. And Lisa and Lance can speak more to this than I can, because I have not done this in my classes for a while. I've been using proctoring primarily. We have additional resources, and we'll also post these resources on the PI, the Program for Instructional Effectiveness website, so that they're available, and we can send these out as well. Those of you who are here in the room, I've got them just on a list for you, so if you want to take a look, some of these resources, we have the document that the ITRC has put together, so that's available, as well as just some resources that have been accumulated across the country for different institutions that are trying to get face-to-face classes online. And then there's also a Harvard Business Publishing webinar that's coming up on Thursday. So especially for those of you who are in business or who have other sort of behaviorally related classes that could benefit from that. And I appreciate my colleague Steve Byers who brought that to our attention. So, all right, well, with that, so I think what we'll do, I'll go ahead and just remain here to field questions as I can. And Lisa and Lance, if you don't mind also doing that, that would be great. Those of you who'd like to stick around, by all means, invite you to do so. But feel free, if this is the time that you want to jet and you feel like you've gotten more than enough information to get you started. If it feels like you're drinking from a fire hydrant, that's pretty normal. But what I hope is that based on this discussion today, that you'll kind of have wrapped your head around some of the parameters, and hopefully it's a little bit more tractable for you. So
I'll jump in here too before people leave. The ITRC homepage has changed. So if you go to our website, you'll find the document that everybody keeps talking about, and you'll see a list.
All right, I'll fill in while Lisa gets.
Thanks, Lance.
So as she was saying, on our ITRC webpage, we've got that document link there. You'll also see being able to schedule appointments with an ITRC staff member. We understand that everyone's time is limited, but you can use that to select anyone, any full-time staff, make an appointment. It syncs with our Google Calendar, so you should be selecting a time that we are also available, so it works for you. The big thing there is for location, you can choose to come to the ITRC or meet via Zoom. We pretty much utilize that tool. And so that's there for faculty to request.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone who attended, and let me turn the time over to Karen really quickly.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Alex. If we could give Alex a round of applause. That was outstanding and very helpful. And Lance and Lisa, thank you both so much. I know you're incredibly busy right now, so thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to answer questions. You all are free to go, but we'll leave the room open for a few more minutes if you have questions for Lance and Lisa, or if you have questions for Alex. So thank you all again for being here. And this is going to be great. We're going to get through this. I know this. So have a great afternoon.
This is Howard Gauthier.
Yes, Howard.
I have a question for Alex. A couple questions.
Sure, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you if you were in the middle of a conversation there.
No, you're great. Your timing is perfect.
I was wondering, as you interact with your students, have you found that it's easier for you to conduct class through a DL classroom, in your office, at home, or something? How does your format work from that perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where the trial and error comes into play. So initially, the very first time I did this, I used my laptop. So I've always used my laptop for Zoom. But originally I had a class, it was a small group, and half of the students were in person in front of me in a classroom, and then the other half were online via Zoom. And it just did not work well in my situation. And what I discovered is that the people who were not in front of me, I answered their questions less immediately. They kind of felt like second-class citizens. And so based on that very first experience, I made the decision going forward that it would either be everyone on Zoom or it would be entirely face-to-face. So it wouldn't be kind of a mix. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Because my classes right now are distance learning, and so I have both a live class and students on their computer. And so just trying to figure out, and so I've got WebRTC. And have you ever used that, or have you only used Zoom?
Yeah, I've only used Zoom. So yeah, it's true. And I think your point is well taken that, depending on the kind of class that you have and the nature, for example, if you're not needing to rely on breakout rooms as much, for example, or something like that, it's probably a lot more amenable to that format, I would guess.
Yeah, okay. And then when your students join the class, do you have them utilize their video or just their audio, or what? Have you found success one way or the other, or does it matter?
Oh yeah, that's another great question. So this is also another point of trial and error for me. Partly this was necessitated because my class sizes are so big. But and particularly before the university used Zoom, some of the older or other programs that we had used didn't have the same bandwidth capacity. And so once I got to about 15 students, it would crash the system if everyone had their videos on. So I got in the habit right away of all students asking them to turn their video cameras off. And once that becomes the norm, students have been pretty good about that. And so, you know, especially for a class of 47, it just makes sense because even if everyone had all of their cameras on, you couldn't see everyone. There's just not enough space on the screen, and it's sort of visually bombarding. So that's kind of the way that I've gone about it. If you've got a smaller class, there are real advantages, I think, to being able to see the video and get some of those nonverbals. So,
boy, that's great. Thank you. I really appreciate your insights.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for attending.
Yeah, thank you for doing this.
I would suggest setting up your Zoom Pro account so that it automatically has their camera off and they're muted.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you could just set it.
You won't have to remind them all to do it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
That's true. So you can, Corey, yes. So Corey raises a great point here in person. So she said that you can turn the settings such where their cameras are muted and their microphones are muted when they enter the room.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. So that saves you a step.
Right.
And then they can individually turn them on.
You have to give them access to turn it on then.
So then, so then you provide them with access to turn it on.
So you're controlling that so that they're not going in and out and it's,
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I don't know, Lance, do you have anything to add to that from kind of your experience?
For the most part, Zoom's been fairly easy to use. It's a tool that I was biased because when I started in the ITRC, we still had Blackboard Collaborate, Blackboard Ultra, and Zoom were the three ones we were balancing between. And so Zoom is definitely by far a good tool to use. I will say that that as far as support, so the ITRC is here for strategies to help you use the tool. When it comes to technical issues, things like I'm not able to join a Zoom meeting or I'm not able to record, I keep getting all these errors. When those things do or will occur, we suggest that you work with the Zoom support. And it's just support.zoom.us. And they've got their contact support there for some of those things. And again, you can always CC us on this to assist you. But yeah, the ITRC is here to help.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to kind of reaffirm what you just said, I had kind of a disastrous situation happen a few weeks ago. I recorded my session and then I tried to upload the video, and probably because of something I did on my end, the video file was corrupted. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm out of luck. And so I contacted Zoom, and they were incredibly helpful. They said, just put the file as it is on your Google Drive. I gave them access to it, and they were able to recover it within 48 hours. So it was just kind of miraculous. So there is really good technical support on their end.
If I might suggest too, I've found that I've learned quite a bit about Zoom by just going to the advanced settings and really scrolling through and exploring it. I was quite surprised and pleased to see some of the options that we had. So like the polling and of course the breakout rooms are really going to help us facilitate our classes.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
I do have one more question too. I noticed when doing that, there's a live stream option in Zoom that I was able to turn on, and it appears that I could link to a YouTube channel or a Facebook or was it Facebook something else. Has anybody used that or any experience with that?
My goodness, that is impressive. I have not.
I know there's a member here in ETS that has used that, Lou Hong, for some of the webinar type stuff. But as far as faculty that I've worked with, I haven't seen that used. There's Lou.
Hey, Lou.
Hi, Alex. The live streaming is a function, but you need to have another piece added into your Zoom account. It's a webinar piece, and just not doing that. It's designed for huge, big webinars.
If
So-
we wanted to do something like that, would we work with ITRC to get that webinar piece added to our account, or do we have that option right now?
I would probably say we should look for a different tool. I'm not sure that you want to use Zoom as the intermediary to get something out to YouTube or Facebook. We can talk about that.
Yeah, maybe once the dust settles, exploring that a little more.
Yeah, it's a different process.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, I'm teaching one course. The regular meeting time is 50 minutes every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So according to your lecture, it seems like if I can schedule one meeting, say 3 or 4 hours with students, they can leave early if they have to. That's gonna be better for them. So I'm worried about how to schedule time. Do I need to follow the original scheduling of the class, say for 50 minutes every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or can I schedule it at a different time? If I can do that, so maybe other instructors are doing the same thing. So do I need to ask students ahead of time to see when you will be available and so on? So how to schedule the time? Do you prefer a short time, say 50 minutes meeting, or probably a longer time, say 3 to 2 hours? If they want to stay, they can stay as longer as they want.
I'm going to jump in here, Alex, for you.
Yeah, please.
So at this point in time, everybody is dealing with this and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think greater flexibility is where we need to be. So in terms of your traditional scheduling, I recommend keeping with your current schedule if you plan to do it that synchronous, because not only are your students probably dealing with class changes, but they might be moving, they might have childcare issues, they might have job issues. So be human. And I would actually recommend exploring options to perhaps only meet for the 50 minutes on Monday and look at what you can put asynchronously for your Wednesday and Friday, or some variation of that. And we'd be happy to talk with you about some of those options to help reduce the load on everybody.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I just do not know how to control the time for the class meeting. Thank you.
That's a great question.
Hi, I have a quick question about student instructors.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I have a number of student instructors that teach labs, and would they be able to get Zoom access through ITRC? Would that be something that you would recommend as something to have our instructors be available to help students with labs?
Yeah, so anyone that's in a teacher role, we have plenty of licensed accounts for those. So if they're doing anything where they're monitoring other students, if they're a graduate teaching assistant, they're co-teaching in Moodle with you, any of those types of situations, we can get them a Zoom account. And that form is on our website, isu.edu/ITRC forms.
Thank you.
Good deal. Other questions?
So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Vincent.
As a follow-up to the last question, so what would you say should be the role of teaching assistants in online classes? Because most of the times I just help the professor in instructing. Sometimes the students have questions, to just walk up to you and ask if they're too shy to go to the professor. But for an online class, this is new. So I don't know, what would you suggest should be the role of teaching assistants?
Yeah, so Vincent, we were kind of huddling here in the main room, and probably the first thing for you to do is to talk to your department chair and get some guidance from that standpoint. I think that one thing to think about is that when you go online, it sort of adds a layer of complexity already to coordinating things. And so that, you know, that might just make it that much more difficult. So probably want to talk to your department chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.